Bruce, one of the first things I wanted to ask you about, I was a while back, I was listening to one of the Wade Keller shows, and I don't remember if it was his flagship show or if it was one of your Bruce Mitchell audio shows, but you talked about Ivan Koloff extensively, really long form. I mean, you went on for a good 30 to 40 minutes without, waiting, interrupting, and it was great. But one of the things specifically you talked about in that discussion was Ivan Koloff being approached by, I think, the FBI backstage at an event because of his
Oh yeah,
anti-American persona. And
right.
I wanted you to talk about that on this show because I thought when you think about where wrestling was back then versus now, where everything was treated so much differently and it was real to us. Can you talk about that situation where Ivan was approached, why it happened, what the outcome was, and all that? Because that was a really cool story.
Well, it was in Georgia Championship Wrestling. It was when he was working for, I believe he was working for Ole Anderson at that point, but it was the Jim Barnett, Ole Anderson configuration of Georgia Championship Wrestling. I want to say 79 or 80. And you can find footage of this time period and Ivan Koloff there. What I'm talking about, he was teaming up with Alexis Smirnoff, who was another Canadian Russian, who named himself after vodka. So how, of course he's from Russia, and and he had the Vladimir Lenin goatee, and just like Ivan Koloff did, and he had the bald head. So they were running roughshod over Georgia. They were the Georgia Tag Team Champions, and Ole, as a babyface before he made his turn on the famous turn on Dusty Rhodes, was fighting him. Ole and Ivan had been partners against Dusty Rhodes, and so he had brought in his brother Lars Anderson. Ole had, and then there's Rock Hunter, I believe, was the manager, and there's the fairly famous match where a babyface Kevin Sullivan and Tony Atlas are fighting the Russians, and the Russians pull out ether and knock out, I believe, Tony Atlas, and supposedly everybody in the studio can smell it, which is the part that I just thought, you got to be kidding. But anyway, so Ivan and Alexis Smirnoff are working the circuit, and I guess someone calls in the FBI. And just a few years before that, Jimmy Carter was president, and Lillian Carter, his mother, was famous for going to Georgia Championship Wrestling shows, and she even took pictures with Mr. Wrestling 2, and then the story was that Mr. Wrestling, and I believe the story that Wrestling 2 was invited to the White House because he was Lillian Carter's favorite wrestler, but he couldn't go because he would not take off the Wrestling 2 mask, because that was his money, that was his gimmick, and he was not going to go in, get his picture taken as a civilian. So that was, as Johnny Walker. So that was, that was how they took it. And so I guess some fans called the FBI and said, you've got these Russians, and they're clearly not only, they talk about sending money back to Russia and all that kind of stuff. They're clearly not on the up and up, and they've got our Georgia Tag Team Championship. And so the FBI comes and says, we got to talk to Ivan Koloff and Alexis Smirnoff. And, Ivan Koloff was famous for staying in the Russian accent no matter what, at work or wherever he was. If he was ordering at Burger King, he was going to order, he was going to stand in line at Burger King, and he was going to order, in that Ivan Koloff voice, in that fake Russian accent. And, he's from Canada. And so he's talking to the guys, and he's talking to the FBI, and they're pretty mad. And he doesn't want to smarten them up, but he just finally goes, "Look, I'm from Canada. I'm just trying to make a living here," And then they backed off and went about their business. And it's just kind of, And if you look at that stuff, I mean, I was a fan back in those years, and I can't imagine anybody in the FBI buying Ivan Koloff as, a legitimate Russian athlete who would come here to win all the wrestling championship, all the professional wrestling championship.
Right.
It's kind of bizarre, but it was a great story. Like Ivan talks about it in this book, and I've heard it, over the years. It's like, it's not a story that anybody thought was not true, because it was something he would have never taught, he never would have made up a story like that. And years later he wrote about it, but it's, that. But he had, those guys, if they had a lot of heat, and if they had enough fans that were mad enough and believed it enough, then I could definitely see the FBI getting called. The FBI investigated lots of stuff, as we know with John Lennon and a lot of other people.
That's just tremendous. Like when you think about it, though. I mean, can you imagine it? I don't know if this would be the same equivalent, but we've made the comparison on our show nowadays, where back then you had these Russians and they're running roughshod on cable television, and this is during the Cold War and all this stuff. And well, imagine if now, like, you had somebody doing an ISIS gimmick, and I mean, that's just, I don't know if that's the same comparison, but it
is the
feels
same
like,
comparison.
yeah, it feels
very
like
much
it would be. So like, and that's what I always say. You'd never see that on TV nowadays. That just goes to show you how different the sport was, or pro wrestling was. That's just one example,
Well,
which is tremendous.
If you look at it culturally, we came out of World War II, and World War II was the world rose up against Nazi Germany, and
Right.
Japan too. But Nazi Germany was clearly, evil. That was, and it was, in this global way, in a real way, good guys versus bad guys. And so, our culture was that we stood up for right. We stood up for what was right. And so after World War II, it became communism. The communism, that Stalin had killed all these, and he's killed millions of people, and that communism was going to take over the world unless the forces of democracy stuck together and fought them off. And so that was a clear-cut good guy, bad guy thing.
Right.
And it was used it was used all in the culture. The communists, the Cold War. We could lose everything. We could, the Cuban Missile Crisis and all that. And so, wrestling companies, they could plug into that good guy, bad guy thing, and they always had. And so that was the next iteration of it. And Ivan Koloff, for my money, was the best of all the Russian bad guys, of all the Cold War, of the Cold Warriors. And it's kind of hard. And now, and even with the Gulf War, there was not this good guy, bad guy, clear cut thing going on. It was, the Middle East. It's confusing. Sides change all the time. And now, with ISIS, I mean, I guess you could do ISIS, but how would you do it? And who would, what ethnicity would you do it? And we're also not so much, one culture rules everything like we were before that. Like there was just one kind of middle class culture, and that's not around now. It's been tried, but people don't feel the same way. I mean, it's different. It's more complicated. It's I guess it's more truthful. I don't know, but it's something that they made tons of money in wrestling with, just because you had that good guy, bad guy dynamic, but they never could, like, I guess Stampede had some North Vietnamese villains and tag teams like that, but you couldn't do the Vietnam War the same way, except for Steve Keirn and Bob Roop doing the angle about Steve Keirn's MIA, missing in action father, which really like hit a nerve and was really dangerous, and it made money, but it was it put Bob Roop in some serious danger. Because I remember in the 70s, you didn't. It amazes me that anybody ever said anything about an MIA like someone said about John McCain, because it was just you never criticized the missing in action from Vietnam. It was it was a very sensitive subject, and understandably so. So for Bob Roop to go out on television as ex-Army and go, well, he clearly was a coward, and Steve Keirn attacked him. I mean, the heat was too hot. It was too dangerous. People were too furious at Bob Roop for daring to say something as vicious and dirty as that.
I get the feeling, though, like, let's just say you tried to do something like ISIS in WWE. Well, it's not going to happen because it's a publicly traded company. But I can't even imagine them even going there. It would have to be a smaller organization in my eyes. I mean, I just don't see a company like that, like, trying to pull something like that off. It would never. We've had this discussion on our show a bunch of times. I just can't see it. But it's just magical to me that the FBI investigated Ivan back then. He was doing such a good job, and he tried and tried and tried to not tell him the truth, and he finally, look, I'm just trying to make money here.
Yeah.
Please bear with me. That's it's
If
an
people
amazing
like,
story.
and the idea was that people got rid of, and it's true. You get rid of some of it at a good wrestling show. You get rid of some of your tension and emotion, and you have a good time, and you root along. Whether you believe everything or not, you root along. If it's working and you're buying into the story, you're letting some stress go, and that was the idea. But I mean, they did. WWE did Davari. They did the terrorist who tried to cut off, was it Undertaker's head or whatever it was, and the stuff doesn't draw that much money anymore. The people are a little, and also they're a little more sophisticated and
Yeah.
to be baited, and then it's kind of hard to be. WWE can do angles that are really in bad taste. They do them all the time, but to do something like that, and then you have the rest of the show being so serious. I mean, so light-hearted or comedic and all that, it just doesn't fit the tone very well.